They say you should never underestimate a quiet widow, and in this story, that warning rings truer than ever. Imagine a lonely ranch, a band of ruthless biker thugs, and one woman's hidden skills that transform a peaceful homestead into a battleground. Gunshots pierce the night, flames light up the sky, and the roar of motorcycles echoes across the fields. It's the ultimate standoff between fear and courage, pitting a small-town community against a gang of outlaws hungry for power. How does it all unfold? Will the bikers learn their lesson, or is there more at stake than anyone realizes? You won't want to miss a single moment of this action-packed saga, so be sure to read on or listen to the whole story to witness the adrenaline-fueled confrontations and surprising twists. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to show your support and stay tuned for more gripping tales. The sun hung low at the wide Montana sky, casting long shadows over the quiet farmland that stretched for miles in every direction. A gentle breeze meandered through the tall grass, whispering against the white picket fence that framed a modest ranch house. This place, known locally as the Duncan Homestead, had once been full of laughter and life. Now it housed only one occupant, Rebecca Duncan, a widow with kind eyes and a resilient spirit. Rebecca was in her early 50s, yet she moved with a quiet vigor that belied her age. She rose every morning before dawn, caring for the few horses and cattle she had left. The ranch was a testament to the life she'd built with her late husband, Joe. They had worked side by side for decades, forging a reputation for integrity and generosity. Since Joe's passing, locals saw Rebecca as a solitary figure who managed her land alone, respectful, helpful when called upon, but always keeping a polite distance. Despite this seemingly peaceful existence, rumors had started circulating among the townsfolk of Havenville, the nearest settlement about 15 miles down the dusty highway. Strange bikes and unfamiliar faces had been spotted along the old back roads. Some folks claimed to have seen men in leather jackets skulking around abandoned barns or loitering near isolated gas stations. Whispers of biker gangs and land grabbers passed from neighbor to neighbor, growing more dramatic with each telling. Where exactly these outsiders were coming from remained uncertain, but it was enough to stir anxiety in an otherwise calm community. Rebecca wasn't one to pay heed to idle gossip. She had chores to do, fences to mend, and bills to pay. If some misfits decided to ride through, well, that was hardly her business. But the first sign that something was truly amiss came when she found a string of footprints near her southern fence line. Deep treads pressed into the mud as if made by heavy boots. At first, she wondered if it might be local hunters chasing deer, but none of her neighbors had mentioned hunting on her property. She dismissed it, feeling a mild prickle of unease, but brushing it aside. That sense of foreboding built a bit more the following day when the old pickup belonging to the local feed store driver rattled down her driveway. He emerged with a worried expression. "I saw some guys on big Harleys prowling around the highway," he told her, handing over a couple bags of seed. "They've been asking about land for sale, or maybe something else. They sure didn't look like your average travelers." Rebecca simply nodded, unsure how else to respond. She did not own a television. Joe had always preferred reading the local newspaper, but she occasionally listened to the radio for weather reports or updates. If the local stations had broadcast any warnings, she had missed them. Even so, the possibility of trouble was clear enough. She found herself checking the doors each evening and keeping the porch light on through the night. The ranch's old barn, its rafters filled with dusty saddles and a few relics from days gone by, suddenly felt like a sanctuary that needed defending. Somewhere in the back of her mind, memories of her younger years stirred, recalling lessons her father had taught her about survival and self-reliance. She had never forgotten how to hold her own. Her strong handshake was testament to that. But she had chosen a quieter life for decades. Little did she know that this quiet existence was about to be shattered. The distant roar of motorcycle engines was creeping closer each day, threatening not just her solitary peace, but also unveiling the hidden side of her past, a side that would soon explode into view. A few days later, the first direct hint of trouble arrived in the form of a battered flyer tacked onto the fence post near her driveway. In bold letters, it advertised a so-called land purchase opportunity, sponsored by a group Rebecca had never heard of, the Iron Stallion Corporation. The contact details listed belonged to a local phone number, but the flyer's cheaply printed image of crossed motorcycle wheels made her stomach tighten. She tore the paper down, examined it for a moment, then went inside to make a call to the county office. An overly polite receptionist had no record of any legitimate organization by that name. "They haven't filed any paperwork or requested permits," the receptionist had said. "If you see anything suspicious, contact the sheriff's department." Rebecca hung up unsettled. As a longtime resident, she knew that official lines of defense in these parts were thin. Sheriffs were stretched over huge territories, and it could take them an hour or more to respond to a call. That same evening, as dusk crawled across the sky, she heard the engines. At first, it was just a faint growl on the wind, hardly more than a hum, but it grew louder, accompanied by the squeak of metal and the heavy throb of motorcycle exhausts. She stepped onto her porch, scanning the horizon. Sure enough, a line of 5 or 6 bikes wove their way along the main road. Their headlights cut bright beams through the encroaching night. They didn't turn up her driveway or even slow down, but Rebecca could see they were scanning the properties on either side of the dusty highway. A chill ran through her. In all her years here, she'd seldom seen more than a pair of motorcycles traveling together, let alone a small convoy like this. She wondered if they were the same men rumored to have asked about land parcels and stolen livestock. Still, she did nothing more than lock up her house, feed her animals, and go to bed, determined not to let fear invade her home. She reminded herself of the well-worn rifle that lay in a locked trunk under her bed, an heirloom from her father. She had barely touched it in years. Memories flickered of long summer afternoons spent practicing her aim on tin cans and fence posts. But those days felt like a distant dream. The next morning dawned crisp and clear. She rose early, shrugged on a flannel shirt, and began tending to her chores. After letting the horses out to pasture, she drove into Havenville for supplies. The little grocery store was abuzz with gossip. Folks huddled in quiet corners, speaking in hushed tones about the biker gang that seemed to be scouting the area. Some had been approached by intimidating men in worn leather jackets, men who offered unbelievably low prices for their land. One elderly couple, the Parkers, had been told that if they didn't sell now, they might face consequences. Rebecca felt a surge of anger at the audacity. What right did these strangers have to barge into a peaceful community and threaten people? She politely offered to help the Parkers, but they insisted they were fine. "We'll just call the sheriff if they come by again," they said, though their eyes betrayed a deep worry. Rebecca left the store with a heavy heart, aware that calling the sheriff might not be enough. She returned to her truck, pausing to look at her reflection in the dusty side mirror. Lines of worry creased her brow. A question tugged at her: should she remain the quiet widow minding her own business, or should she take a stand? Something inside her, a part that she'd buried for years, whispered that it might be time to protect what was hers by any means necessary. Over the following week, the tension built like a summer storm cloud on the horizon. Reports trickled in from neighbors' fences, cut livestock missing, and menacing graffiti spray-painted on barns and garages. The newly arrived bikers, who seemed to call themselves the Wraith Riders, had grown bolder. They traveled the roads in larger numbers, now sometimes blocking intersections for their own convenience. Word was that they were led by a wiry man with a relentless glare named Blade Caldwell. He was rumored to have come from the southwestern states, bringing with him a crew of misfits and ex-cons looking for easy pickings. Local businesses began closing earlier, and people began locking doors they once left open without a second thought. The official line from the small sheriff's substation was to stay calm and report suspicious activity, but it was obvious the authorities were outmanned. The Wraith Riders rode freely, stirring up trouble with little fear of repercussions. Yet for all their bravado, they had not directly confronted Rebecca until one hot afternoon when she found 3 of them lingering at the entrance to her driveway. Their bikes were parked haphazardly, engines idling with a low rumble as if to make their presence impossible to ignore. One man, his beard braided into 2 tight forks, stepped forward. He tipped his head at Rebecca in a mock greeting. "Afternoon," he drawled, voice dripping with false courtesy. His jacket bore the insignia of 2 black wings spread wide and the letters Wraith stitched across the back. Rebecca held her ground by the side of her truck. She noticed how their eyes swept over her property, taking stock of the outbuildings and possibly assessing the livestock in the fields. Her heart pounded, but she refused to let them see any sign of fear. "Afternoon," she replied, matching his tone with a calm confidence that surprised even herself. "We've heard you might be open to selling." Another biker chimed in, jabbing a thumb toward her land. He wore tinted goggles and a bandana that covered his forehead, giving him a sinister appearance. "This is prime real estate for a new operation. You could make a pretty penny, you know." She narrowed her eyes. "Not interested," she said simply. Braided Beard raised an eyebrow, exchanging a glance with his companions. "Maybe you should think about it more carefully," he said, stepping closer. Be a shame if anything were to happen out here. This place is so isolated. Rebecca felt her stomach clench, but she stood tall. I'll keep that in mind, she answered coolly. Now, if you'll move your bikes, I have work to do. For a moment, tension filled the air like a coiled snake ready to strike. Then Goggles snorted in amusement. Let's go, he said, though his tone carried a warning. They revved their engines and took off down the driveway, leaving a swirl of dust in their wake. When the sound of their bikes faded, Rebecca exhaled slowly. She glanced at the door of the barn, remembering the old trunk with her father's rifle. Maybe she had hoped she'd never need it again, but now the threat was knocking at her door literally. She had a choice to make: stand passively by and pray the authorities would somehow help, or face these men on her own terms. And there was a time, a long time ago, when she had learned how to handle a six-shooter better than most folks ever could. Joe had teased her, calling her his crack-shot cowgirl. Little did these bikers know that the Quiet Widow had once been the fastest draw in 3 counties. That evening, Rebecca found herself in the barn, the last rays of sunlight filtering through the warped wooden slats. Dust motes danced in the golden light as she walked past her father's antique tractor and stacked hay bales. She paused at the far end, where an old wooden chest had been pushed up against the wall. The lock was stiff with years of disuse, but with a bit of coaxing, it clicked open. Inside lay a piece of her past, a lever-action rifle carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from rust. Beside it lay a revolver, a classic six-shooter with a well-worn grip and a set of carefully stored ammunition. These were not trophies, but tools from a different era of her life. Back when she was in her 20s, traveling the rodeo circuit, she'd garnered a reputation as a trick shooter. She had countless ribbons and medals to prove it, though most were tucked away in the attic. She'd left that life behind when she married Joe and embraced the quieter responsibilities of ranch living. Her eyes traced the contours of the old revolver. Muscle memory tingled in her hand. She wondered if she still had it in her. Could she still draw and fire with the same speed and accuracy? Setting aside her pride, she removed the gun, rolled open a cylinder of bullets, and gingerly loaded a few. She stepped outside where the sky was turning a gentle shade of purple. Years ago, Joe had set up a makeshift shooting range behind the barn, primarily to scare off coyotes. The target, a faded piece of plywood with circles crudely drawn in black paint, was still there. Rebecca took a moment to center herself, letting the old instincts resurface. She exhaled and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out across the silent fields, echoing off the barn walls. A small hole appeared near the center of the target, not perfectly centered, but close enough. A cautious satisfaction flooded through her. The second shot was better, closer to the bullseye. The third shot grazed the edge of the mark, but she knew with practice she could tighten her grouping. Before she realized it, she had emptied the cylinder and reloaded. The rhythmic pattern of firing and reloading felt like a dance she once knew by heart. Memories of rodeo, crowds cheering. Her trick shots came rushing back, along with the memory of Joe's beaming face. When she finally lowered the weapon, the target was riddled with holes clustered in a tight radius. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from an adrenaline she hadn't felt in years. She glanced over at the main road. The sun had all but disappeared, and in the distance, she thought she glimpsed the faint glow of motorcycle headlights weaving along the horizon. Quietly, she returned the revolver and rifle to the barn, storing them in an easier-to-access spot. She would not seek trouble, but she could be prepared for it. A wave of relief and apprehension washed over her. She was stepping into dangerous territory, but what choice did she really have? These men had threatened her home, her sense of peace. They assumed she was just a vulnerable widow, a soft target. Maybe it was time for them to discover otherwise. Heading back to the house, Rebecca latched the barn door securely. She had always been a law-abiding citizen, never once looking for a fight. But the illusions of her old life had melted away, replaced by a raw instinct to protect what she held dear. If the Wraith Riders thought they could scare her off her land, they would soon learn that a lifetime of quiet did not mean a lifetime of weakness. Morning broke with a fiery red sunrise, an omen some might consider foreboding. Rebecca awoke with a renewed sense of determination, plans already taking shape in her mind. She spent the early hours tending to her ranch tasks as usual, feeding the cattle, checking fence lines, but with an added vigilance. Whenever she heard an engine in the distance, she stopped what she was doing, scanning the horizon until she could identify the source. After her chores, she drove into Havenville with a carefully crafted list. First on her agenda was a visit to the local hardware store. She greeted the owner, Mr. Garvey, with a polite nod. Over the years, he had seen her only a handful of times, but he knew the Duncan family by reputation. She picked up lengths of chain padlocks, heavy-duty nails, and other items that might fortify her property. Mr. Garvey gave her a curious look as he rang up the purchase, but politely said nothing. The tension around town had put everyone on edge, so no one questioned measures of caution anymore. Next, she stopped at the feed store to gather more supplies for her animals. The clerk there, an elderly woman named Martha, leaned in and whispered, "Did you hear what happened to the Anderson place?" Martha's voice trembled as she described how the Wraith Riders had slashed tires on the Andersons' trucks and spray-painted threats on their barn. They put a demand note on the door telling them to sell, or else. Rebecca felt anger flare within her once more. The Andersons were decent folks who had never harmed a soul. By midday, she returned to her ranch and began securing the outbuildings. She added stronger locks to the barn and the garage, making sure that if someone tried to break in, they'd have a tough time doing so quietly. Around the perimeter of the house, she set up a few rudimentary alarms, a spool of wire connected to cans and small bells that would jingle if anyone tried to sneak around. She wasn't an engineer, but she remembered enough from her father's ranching days to improvise. Her final task was to clear out an old tool shed that faced the main driveway. It was a perfect vantage point to watch any approaching vehicles. She placed a small stool inside along with a pair of binoculars and a flashlight, just in case. She also stashed the lever-action rifle there, unloaded but within easy reach. Exhausted from a day's work under the scorching sun, she took a moment to stand near the shed, gazing out at the open fields. The unbroken expanse of land had once comforted her, but now it felt like a stage on which a dangerous game was about to unfold. She recalled the quiet mornings she used to spend with Joe, sipping coffee on the porch, discussing the weather or the latest ranch tasks. Part of her longed for those simpler times, but another part, the part that was awakening now, was ready to protect this land by any means necessary. The lonely wail of a distant train whistle carried across the plains as twilight approached. She imagined the Wraith Riders out there, possibly holed up in an abandoned building or some makeshift camp. She could practically feel the tension mounting like a spark waiting for its tinder. For the first time, she allowed herself to think about a confrontation, a real physical one. Would she hesitate to pull the trigger if pushed to the brink? The question echoed in her mind as she headed back inside, locking the door behind her. News of the Wraith Riders' intimidation tactics spread quickly through Havenville, and the community started looking to each other for support. The local diner, Betty's Eats, became an impromptu town hall where ranchers and shopkeepers gathered to share updates. Rebecca, usually reclusive, found herself seated at one of the booths listening as various locals recounted their run-ins. A wiry man named Hank stood to speak. "They showed up at my ranch last night," he began, voice strained with anger. "Told me my land was worthless, but they'd take it off my hands for pennies on the dollar. When I refused, one of them kicked my dog, broke the poor animal's leg. Sheriff says he'll do what he can, but we all know he's outnumbered." A murmur of outrage rippled through the diner. Rebecca clenched her fist beneath the table. She shot a glance around. Many faces shared the same look of frustration and fear. It wasn't just about money or land anymore. It was about a group of bullies turning the town's quiet existence into a nightmare. Betty, the diner's owner, placed a comforting hand on Hank's shoulder before offering her own thoughts. "We might have to defend ourselves," she said softly. "Legally, physically, whatever it takes." Several nodded in agreement. Rebecca was quiet through most of the meeting, but at the end, she cleared her throat and spoke up. "My place is pretty isolated," she said. "If anyone needs a safe spot or even just somewhere to stash valuables or livestock, you can bring them over. I'm not afraid of these thugs." It was a bold statement, and a few eyebrows shot up. People knew Rebecca as a capable rancher, but not as someone who would openly challenge a gang of criminals. After the meeting, a small group lingered by the diner's counter, discussing the possibility of forming a neighborhood watch or a volunteer patrol. Rebecca suggested a phone chain, where each household would call the next in line if trouble was brewing. Everyone agreed it was a good start, but the uneasy truth remained. The Wraith Riders were dangerous, likely armed, and had little respect for local law enforcement. Leaving the diner, Rebecca felt a glimmer of solidarity in the community's collective stand, but she also sensed the dread that underpinned it. As she climbed into her truck, she nearly jumped at the sight of a large tattooed biker idling across the street. He was watching the diner, a smirk curling across his lips. His vest bore the same emblem she had seen before, black wings with the word Wraith emblazoned under them. Their eyes locked for a moment before he revved his engine and peeled away. On the drive home, tension knotted her stomach. They were monitoring the townspeople, gauging their strength and their will to resist. She recalled a phrase her father used to say, "Corner a rattlesnake, and you better expect to get bit." The Wraith Riders were cornering an entire community, but she suspected they had no idea how many rattlesnakes they might provoke in the process. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table sipping tea and going over her mental checklist. The rifle was secured, ammo stocked. The tool shed vantage point was ready. The hidden revolver would be on her at all times. If she had to, she'd use it. She was worried about the people of Havenville, her longtime friends and neighbors, but she also felt a growing confidence that she was no longer just a widow waiting to be victimized. She was reclaiming a piece of herself that had been dormant for too long, and it wasn't going to end well for anyone who tried to push her too far. The next few days brought an ominous calm. It was like the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable showdown. Rebecca continued her daily routine, feeding animals, repairing fences, watering the garden, but her eyes constantly roved the perimeter of her property. She half expected to see a line of motorcycles cresting the hill at any moment. One afternoon, the phone rang. On the other end was Mrs. Parker, an elderly neighbor who lived closer to town. Her voice shook with fear. "They've been sniffing around our place again, dear." She said, her words tumbling out quickly. "We're heading to our daughters in the next county. Could we bring our horses over to your ranch?" "We don't want to leave them unattended." Without hesitation, Rebecca agreed. By evening, the Parkers arrived, visibly shaken. She helped them unload two tired-looking mares into one of her corrals. Mrs. Parker hugged her in gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "We just can't risk them being harmed or taken." Rebecca simply offered a reassuring smile. "They'll be safe here," she promised. After the Parkers left, Rebecca noticed something that put her on edge: fresh tire tracks in the dirt leading up to the southern fence line. They looked like motorcycle tires angled, as if someone had pulled off the highway to watch the ranch from a concealed vantage point. She felt a chill crawl up her spine. Had they been observing the Parkers' arrival? Was her ranch now on the top of their list? That night, she made a point of checking her improvised alarms. The wire and bells remained in place around the house, and she scattered a few more near the barn. She also loaded the rifle and placed it within arm's reach in the living room. Around midnight, she dozed off in her armchair, the faint glow of a table lamp illuminating the silent house. At some point in the early morning hours, she jolted awake, heart pounding. She wasn't sure if she'd heard a noise or if it was just the echo of a dream. She strained her ears. Silence, then in the distance, an engine revved. Her grip tightened on the rifle. The noise faded, leaving her in darkness and uncertainty. By dawn, she was out in the yard searching for signs of trespass. Sure enough, she found footprints, heavy boot prints near the corral where the Parkers' horses were kept. The horses themselves seemed agitated, stamping and snorting more than usual. Rebecca ran her hand along the top rail of the fence, finding fresh scratches as if someone had leaned against it. A surge of anger coursed through her. They were escalating their tactics, trying to intimidate her and her neighbors. She led the horses to a safer pen closer to the house, then took a walk to the southern fence line, rifle slung across her back. She found more evidence of recent activity: discarded cigarette butts, a crumpled candy wrapper. The Wraith Riders or someone working for them was definitely watching. Perhaps they considered her a stubborn holdout, an example to make for the rest of the town. If that was their plan, they had picked the wrong ranch. She decided then and there, when the confrontation came, she wouldn't wait passively. She'd be ready, and she'd fight back with every skill she possessed. It happened 2 nights later, when the moon was just a sliver in the sky and the darkness seemed especially thick. Rebecca was in the living room, the lights turned low to avoid drawing attention. She had dozed off in her armchair again, rifle leaning against the wall, when a violent crash jolted her awake. Her front window shattered in a spray of glass shards. At nearly the same moment, an explosion of noise echoed from the barn. A deafening bang, followed by the panicked whinny of horses. Ducking low, she grabbed her rifle. Heart pounding, she crept to the shattered window and peered outside. The faint glow of a half-broken floodlight revealed figures in the yard, at least 3 or 4 men. Their motorcycles were parked by the fence, engines idling. She could just make out the Wraith Riders' insignia on their jackets. One had a thick metal chain draped over his shoulder, another held a crowbar. "Come on out, widow," one of them shouted, voice dripping with cruelty. "We just want to talk." Rebecca's mind raced. She had set up a plan for exactly this scenario. She quickly moved down the hallway, making sure to keep her head low. The small device she'd rigged by the back door, a makeshift tripwire, would at least alert her if someone tried to circle around. She could also slip out through the side if she had to. But first she needed to protect her animals in the barn. Through another window, she saw flickers of light. Someone had tossed a flare or a Molotov cocktail near the barn entrance. Smoke curled up in the moonlight. The horses were panicking, kicking the walls of their stalls. Time was running out. Steeling herself, she raised her rifle and slipped onto the porch. She lined up a shot at the closest intruder, a tall, lanky man swinging a chain at her porch steps. Before he could react, she squeezed the trigger, aiming low. The bullet tore into the dirt by his feet, sending a spray of earth into his shins. He yelped and jumped back, startled. "You want to talk? Then back off," Rebecca shouted. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, thick with the adrenaline surging through her veins. The men froze momentarily, unsure, but then their leader, a muscular brute with a shaved head, snarled, "Don't just stand there, rush her." Two of them dashed toward the porch, the chain clanging ominously. Rebecca's next shot was more direct. She fired at the wooden railing, splintering it inches from one man's torso. He dove sideways, cursing. The chain rattled to the ground. She was deliberately aiming to miss, hoping to scare them off rather than seriously injure anyone. But these men seemed too reckless, too sure of their dominance to retreat so easily. Meanwhile, flames were dancing higher by the barn. She heard the corrugated metal roof pop and crack in the heat. If she didn't act fast, her animals and the Parkers' horses could be trapped or killed. Gritting her teeth, she retreated inside, slammed the door, and grabbed a portable fire extinguisher from under the sink. She dashed out the back, circling around the side of the house. Sure enough, she nearly tripped over a figure lurking in the shadows. A gloved hand grabbed at her arm, trying to yank her off balance. But Rebecca twisted free, letting muscle memory from her trick-riding days guide her. She spun and drove the butt of the extinguisher into the man's ribs. He crumpled with a groan. She didn't wait to see if he stayed down. Sprinting to the barn, she found the corner engulfed in flame. She aimed the extinguisher and let loose, spraying the base of the fire. Coughing through the smoke, she heard more voices shouting from the yard. The chaos had only just begun. Amid the swirling smoke and confusion, Rebecca managed to extinguish the flames licking at the barn's entrance. She dropped the spent canister, gasping for fresh air, and flung the barn doors wide. The horses, terrified, surged toward the exit. She quickly grabbed their halters, trying to calm them as they bolted out into the open. Most of them galloped away into the darkness, but the important thing was that they were safe from the flames. Then came a flash of movement in her peripheral vision. She spun around to see the muscular brute who had urged his men to rush her. He was brandishing a length of pipe. "Brave old lady," he sneered, stepping closer. "Think you're some kind of gunslinger." Her heart thundered in her chest, but she raised the rifle anyway. "Go," she warned, voice steady despite the tension. "Take your men and leave. You've done enough damage." He let out a cruel laugh and lunged. At such close range, a rifle was awkward. She managed a quick swing of the barrel, cracking him across the jaw, but not before he slammed her shoulder with the pipe. Pain exploded through her arm, and she stumbled backward, losing grip of her weapon. Just as he raised the pipe again, a shot rang out, striking the ground near his foot. Both of them froze. A voice shouted from the darkness, "Step away from Mrs. Duncan." It was Hank, the neighbor who had spoken at Betty's diner. Behind him stood two more ranchers, each armed with a shotgun. They had heard the commotion and come to help. Relief and gratitude surged through Rebecca, even as her shoulder throbbed. The brute snarled, stepping back. From behind the barn, two more bikers appeared, only to find themselves outnumbered by local ranchers who had arrived in trucks, headlights illuminating the yard. The tide was turning rapidly. One of the Wraith Riders spat on the ground. "We can't take 'em all, Blade," he muttered, eyeing the newly arrived defenders. The man called Blade glared at Rebecca, eyes full of malice. "This ain't over," he hissed before turning to sprint for his bike. His crew followed suit, engines roaring as they tore off into the night, leaving a haze of dust in their wake. In the sudden stillness, the locals rushed to Rebecca's side. Hank helped her to her feet, concern etched on his face. "Are you all right?" he asked, noticing her pained expression. She nodded, wincing as she cradled her arm. "I think it's just bruised. Thank you for coming." She glanced around, spotting other neighbors she recognized. Martha, the feed store clerk, old Mr. Garvey from the hardware shop, even Betty from the diner. They had come armed with whatever they could find, shotguns, pitchforks, crowbars. Some were still wearing pajamas, indicating they had rushed over as soon as the alarm spread through the phone chain. "That was some fine shooting," one man commented, noticing the bullet holes near the porch and the incapacitated attacker near the side of the house. "I never knew you had it in you." Rebecca offered a weary smile. I never wanted to use it, she admitted. The entire yard was a mess of shattered glass, scorched grass, and scattered debris. But at least for now, the gang was gone, beaten back by a sudden show of collective force. Even so, her mind kept replaying Blade's parting words. This ain't over. She had no doubt he meant it. The Wraith Riders might regroup, possibly bringing more men, more firepower. But tonight had shown something else. Havenville was not defenseless. They might be a small community, but they cared for each other deeply, and that was a strength far greater than any bully on a motorcycle could comprehend. The following day dawned on a scene of quiet activity. Neighbors came together to help Rebecca clean up the damage. They replaced broken windows, hammered new boards over scorched patches of the barn, and checked on the livestock that had scattered overnight. The Parkers returned relieved to see their horses safe if a little shaken from the commotion. Betty brought over hot coffee and pastries, while Martha organized a small group to patrol the surrounding roads. A sense of solidarity pervaded the air, the community more united than ever. Rebecca, her arm in a makeshift sling, directed the repairs. Though in pain, she felt a renewed purpose. As she and Hank hammered fresh planks onto the barn wall, she spoke softly. "You saved my life last night. I can't thank you enough." "We're neighbors," Hank replied, driving in a nail. "That's what neighbors do." They worked in companionable silence for a moment before he added, "I never knew you could handle a gun like that." A rueful laugh escaped her. "I used to be quite the sharpshooter in my younger days. Trick, riding trick, shooting the whole rodeo scene. I left that all behind when I married Joe." She paused, eyes drifting over the fields. "But I guess some things stay with you." Hank nodded, impressed. "Well, it sure came in handy. Word's gotten around town. People are calling you the Cowboy Widow." "Don't be surprised if that nickname sticks." She shook her head, smiling despite herself. "I'd rather just be Rebecca Duncan. But if a little legend helps keep the bikers at bay, so be it." Later that afternoon, the sheriff finally arrived with a couple of deputies apologizing for the delay. They took statements from Rebecca and the other witnesses, surveyed the damage, and promised to intensify patrols. However, Rebecca couldn't help but notice the worry in the sheriff's eyes. He knew how outmatched his department was if the Wraith Riders returned in full force. As the sun dipped low, the repairs were nearly complete. The immediate crisis seemed over, but an undercurrent of unease lingered. Blade Caldwell and his gang were still out there licking their wounds and possibly plotting retaliation. Even with the community's newfound unity, a sense of looming threat clung to the dusty roads. In the early evening, Rebecca walked through the corral, checking on the horses. She paused to admire their resilience despite the chaos. They had settled back into their routine of grazing and flicking flies away with their tails. Somehow nature always found a way to restore order, even after a storm. She looked out over the horizon, the sky painted with streaks of orange and pink. For the first time since the trouble began, she felt a sense of peace. Her thoughts turned to her late husband. Joe would have been proud of how the town came together, how neighbors stood up for each other. He would have teased her for waiting so long to pick up a firearm again, reminding her of the time she outshot half the men in a traveling Wild West show. The memory made her chuckle softly to herself. Just then she spotted a dust trail on the main road, a single motorcycle approaching. Her heart lurched, but as the bike drew closer, she realized it was carrying the same tattooed man she'd seen in town. Not Blade, but another senior figure in the gang. He slowed to a stop by the front fence, both hands raised in a gesture of peace. No other bikers followed. Rebecca stood by the corral, watching warily. The man killed the engine, removed his helmet, and called out, "We're leaving." Blade got orders from higher up. "This place ain't worth the trouble." His voice carried easily in the still air. "Word got out that this town fights back. We'll find somewhere else." She took a few cautious steps forward, the rifle at her side. "That's it. You're just giving up." He shrugged, glancing around at the repaired barn, the newly secured windows, and the obvious presence of neighbors nearby. "Yeah, we're done here, but don't think we'll forget, and don't think we'll go easy on the next town." Rebecca said nothing, her jaw clenched. Part of her wanted to demand that they never return, that they abandon this life of intimidation altogether. But she knew some battles extended beyond her reach. The best she could do was ensure her own home and her community remained safe. Satisfied, the man climbed back onto his bike, revved the engine, and sped off. A cloud of dust lingered behind him, slowly dissipating in the evening light. Rebecca exhaled a breath that she didn't realize she'd been holding. A few neighbors who had been watching from a distance exchanged relieved glances. Night fell over Havenville, the stars glittering in the broad Montana sky. The threat was receding, but the lesson endured. Peace was only as strong as the community willing to defend it. Rebecca understood more clearly than ever that sometimes you have to stand up and fight for what you cherish. It wasn't about seeking violence, but about refusing to cower in its shadow. As the last of the twilight faded, she returned to her porch rifle in hand. She set it aside gently, watching the silhouettes of her neighbors heading home. In the days and weeks ahead, the town would heal from this ordeal. Lives would go on, and the ranch would once again settle into the gentle rhythms of rural life. But somewhere in the distance, the faint roar of motorcycle engines would remain a reminder that darkness can appear at any time, and good people must be prepared to meet it with courage and unity. In the quiet that followed, Rebecca allowed herself a weary smile. They had underestimated a widow with a rifle and a past full of cowboy tricks. Now Havenville was safe again, and she could return to a simpler life, though not without the knowledge that if trouble ever came, knocking again, she'd be ready to show the world that a quiet widow's cowboy skills could explode at any moment. From my perspective, this showdown isn't just about guns and grit. It's a testament to the unbreakable spirit of community and the power that lies within each of us when we decide enough is enough. Our unassuming widow reclaimed her band and her past, drawing on dormant skills and the backing of an entire town. In the end, kindness and unity overcame intimidation, reminding us all that real courage often wears a humble face. As we wrap up this epic tale, I invite everyone to reflect on what it means to stand up for what's right. Have you ever felt underestimated? Do you believe that strong bonds between neighbors can outshine the toughest threats? Drop your comments below and let's keep the conversation going. Thank you for tuning in, and remember to subscribe for more stories that inspire, entertain, and spark debate.